It was an unusually humid Wednesday morning in Washington, D.C., as reporters buzzed like bees outside the Capitol building. The House was scheduled for a high-profile hearing, one that had already caught the attention of every major news outlet. At the center of the storm? Two men, Speaker Mike Johnson and Representative Jamie Raskin. For months, a quiet but growing tension had simmered between the two. Jamie Raskin, known for his sharp legal mind and frequent appearances on progressive networks, had been outspoken about what he referred to as right-wing overreach in recent hearings. On the other hand, Speaker Mike Johnson, the newly empowered conservative leader of the House, had steadily gained respect and influence with a steady, strategic approach and a deep conviction in restoring what he called constitutional clarity. But what no one knew was that today, this very hearing would explode into something no one had anticipated. The subject at hand was a heated investigation into alleged government overreach and misuse of federal agencies for political gain. The Republican majority had called in whistleblowers and subpoenaed documents tied to years of questionable surveillance operations and politically motivated prosecutions. Many Democrats, including Raskin, dismissed the investigation as a conspiracy-laced distraction. The chamber was packed. Even the back rows were filled with staffers, aides, and curious reporters trying to get a glimpse. C-SPAN's cameras were rolling. The American public was tuning in. At precisely 9 a.m., Speaker Mike Johnson entered the chamber not with bombast, but with the calm resolve of a man who knew exactly what was coming. Jamie Raskin was already seated, flipping through a thick binder of notes. When Johnson approached the chair, their eyes locked for a brief moment. It wasn't hatred. It was something deeper, ideological opposition forged by years of radically different visions for America. Johnson opened the session. This hearing, he said firmly, is not about politics. It's about transparency. It's about truth. And it's about ensuring that federal power is never used to silence, suppress, or spy on the American people. Raskin was the first to speak in opposition. His tone was sharp. What we are seeing today is a dangerous rewriting of reality, Mr. Speaker. This is a weaponized narrative designed to distract from actual issues, climate change, healthcare, gun violence. This hearing is political theater. Murmurs broke out across the room. Johnson didn't flinch. Then, the first witness was called, a former senior official from within a federal agency who alleged that political targeting had taken place during both Democratic and Republican administrations, but was escalated under the guise of national security. He dropped names, provided documents, described internal memos that painted a chilling picture. Jamie Raskin leaned forward, scanning the papers with furrowed brows. But it wasn't until Johnson took the floor again that the room truly erupted. Congressman Raskin, Johnson said, turning directly to his colleague, you speak of dangerous narratives. But let me ask you, were you aware that during the prior administration, internal FBI memos labeled concerned parents at school board meetings as potential domestic terrorists? Raskin scoffed. That claim has been debunked. Those were isolated cases and taken out of context. Johnson raised a thick folder. I have here, Mr. Raskin, over 200 pages of internal communications that say otherwise. With dates, names, authorization codes. The truth has a way of surviving even when buried under bureaucratic language. The crowd went silent. Reporters leaned in. This isn't political theater, Johnson continued, voice unwavering. This is the accountability the American people deserve. And it's high time we all stopped pretending this kind of overreach never happened on either side of the aisle. Raskin opened his mouth to respond, but found no words. For the first time, the congressman from Maryland looked visibly shaken. Outside the chamber, social media exploded. Hashtags like #TruthUnleashed and #Johnson vs. Raskin trended within minutes. But this was only the beginning. As the session resumed after a brief recess, the atmosphere in the hearing chamber had shifted. What started as just another partisan battle was now spiraling into a full-blown unraveling of something much bigger. The documents Mike Johnson held weren't just a political stunt, they were potent, damning, and loaded with implications. Jamie Raskin returned to his seat with a renewed fire in his eyes. Though rattled, he wasn't one to back down without a fight. As the cameras rolled, he adjusted his tie, flipped through his binder again, and leaned into the microphone. Mr. Speaker, he said, carefully choosing each word, you've made some compelling claims. But you and I both know context matters. Were there overreaches? Possibly. But the system is built to self-correct. There are checks and balances for a reason. Johnson didn't blink. Then explained to the American people why the internal audit of federal enforcement protocols commissioned under your party's watch was sealed for over a year. Why was it buried? Raskin paused. That's a classified matter and not appropriate for open session. Johnson raised his hand, signaling to a staffer who walked over and handed him a sealed envelope. Johnson opened it slowly, pulling out a set of unclassified excerpts officially cleared just that morning. Let's unseal it then. He began to read aloud from the report. Page 67, line 12, data reveals disproportionate monitoring of conservative political groups in the Midwest and southern United States under suspicion of extremism despite no credible evidence. Gasps echoed across the chamber. Raskin interjected. This is cherry-picked. You're reading from an interim draft. No, Congressman. Johnson cut him off sharply. This is the final, signed version. And you knew it existed, because your office co-authored the executive summary. Silence. At that moment, even some Democrats looked at Raskin with confusion. Mike Johnson wasn't done. Let me ask you directly, Representative Raskin. Did you or did you not authorize a memo categorizing certain political expressions, including anti-lockdown protests, traditionalist religious gatherings, and opposition to certain education policies, as indicators of extremism? Raskin's hands clenched the microphone. That language was part of a broader threat analysis. It was not meant to label ordinary Americans. It was intended to identify patterns of organized disinformation. Johnson shook his head. Disinformation or dissent? Because to many Americans, those are two very different things. The crowd in the hearing room buzzed again. Journalists rapidly typed quotes into live feeds. The political temperature was rising fast. Then came the moment no one saw coming. Johnson tapped his tablet, prompting the large screen behind the dais to flicker on. A grainy video clip began playing, security footage from a government briefing room, time-stamped and verified. It showed a meeting from 18 months earlier. Sitting at the table, mid-level agency officials, political operatives, and Jamie Raskin. The audio was clear. One voice, belonging to a federal advisor, said, "We need a way to get ahead of this conservative surge at school board meetings." Another voice, unmistakably Raskin's, replied, "Then tie it to domestic extremism concerns. Get the media involved. The perception matters more than the truth." Boom. The room exploded into gasps and muffled chaos. Order. Johnson banged the gavel. Raskin sat frozen, face pale. That's taken out of context. I was referring to violent threats, not peaceful protesters. But it was too late. The damage was done. The clip went viral within seconds, already circulating on cable news and social media. TikTok, Twitter, YouTube, every platform was ablaze. Johnson stood firm. This is not about silencing Democrats, Congressman. This is about accountability. The American people deserve to know if their representatives are complicit in efforts to suppress their voices. The speaker's voice boomed across the chamber. We will not weaponize government to silence political opposition. Not on my watch. Raskin tried to recover, but his responses were drowned out by the buzz of voices and murmurs of disbelief around him. In that moment, the tide had turned, and the real truth, the one buried beneath bureaucracy, denials, and media narratives, had begun to rise to the surface. In the hours following the explosive hearing, chaos rippled through Washington like a shockwave. Mainstream news anchors scrambled to reframe the story. Conservative outlets declared it a political earthquake. Social media became a battleground of ideologies, with hashtags like #MikeUnleashed and #RaskinExposed trending across platforms. Outside the Capitol, protesters on both sides began to gather. Some held signs reading, "Free speech is not extremism," while others shouted back, "Out of context lies." Meanwhile, behind closed doors, damage control had begun. Jamie Raskin's office immediately issued a statement. The video footage presented by Speaker Johnson was selectively edited and misleading. Congressman Raskin stands by his record of defending civil liberties and rejects the idea that political dissent was ever labeled extremist under his direction. But it wasn't enough. That evening, Speaker Johnson appeared live on a primetime town hall hosted by a national news network. His calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the panic behind the scenes on the other side of the aisle. "Mr. Speaker," the host asked, "you effectively accused a fellow congressman of greenlighting surveillance on everyday Americans. What do you say to critics who claim you're using your power for political gain?" Johnson leaned in. I say this, the American people have watched for far too long as Washington insiders bend the rules, hide behind classified memos, and redefine dissent as danger. This is not about politics. This is about truth. And if we don't confront it now, we'll lose the very core of our republic. He held up the now viral folder again, thumbing through highlighted sections for the cameras. Parents were labeled threats. Churches were flagged for being ideological hubs. Whistleblowers were silenced. And all of this happened while members of Congress, including Mr. Raskin, looked the other way. Back in Congress, Democratic leaders called an emergency closed-door meeting. Panic was setting in. Raskin's once unshakable legal mind was now under fire, even from allies. "Jamie, did you really say that in the video?" a colleague asked bluntly. "I did," Raskin replied, eyes heavy. "But it wasn't what it sounded like. You know that." Maybe came the reply. But the American people don't. Pressure mounted. Republican lawmakers filed a motion to launch a bipartisan oversight investigation into government surveillance practices over the last decade. And surprisingly, some moderate Democrats began signaling openness to it, perhaps sensing the political winds shifting. But the biggest twist came the next day. An anonymous source within a federal agency, codenamed Sentinel, reached out to multiple media outlets. They claimed to have internal documents, audio recordings, and emails that corroborated Johnson's accusations and more. A leaked email hit the press late that night. Per Raskin directive, identify rhetoric tied to school curriculum protests, gun rights advocacy, and election integrity claims. Flag as potential extremism. Forward to DHS liaison. The sender? A senior official in the DOJ's Internal Operations Branch. By morning, Jamie Raskin's political future hung by a thread. And Johnson? He stood taller than ever, not because he had destroyed an opponent, but because he had forced Washington to confront a truth long buried, that the real danger wasn't extremism, it was the quiet, bureaucratic suppression of those who dared to question power. Inside the speaker's office, Johnson sat alone for a moment, reflecting. His aides had gone home. The sun was setting over the Potomac. This was never about winning a soundbite or scoring political points. This was about lighting a fuse, one that would burn through layers of lies and illuminate what had been hidden for too long. And he knew the real fight was just beginning. The days following the hearing became some of the most turbulent Washington had seen in years. Within 72 hours, 3 whistleblowers, including 2 former analysts from Homeland Security and 1 retired intelligence contractor, came forward. In an exclusive interview with an independent news outlet, one of them, known only as Marla, made a staggering revelation. "We were told to create profiles not just on violent actors but on vocal dissenters. If a citizen questioned a vaccine mandate or school policy on social media, that was enough to flag them. It didn't matter if they were peaceful. It mattered that they opposed the narrative." The bombshell clip exploded across the country, triggering congressional phone lines to light up. Constituents on both sides began demanding answers. What had started as a clash between 2 congressmen had morphed into a national reckoning on surveillance, speech, and power. Mike Johnson called for a special session in the House Oversight Committee. This time, it wasn't just about pointing fingers. It was about accountability and exposure. "Let me be clear," Johnson said as cameras rolled, "this is no longer about partisan disagreements. This is about whether our own government used taxpayer-funded resources to silence the very people it was supposed to protect." He paused, then turned to the hearing chamber filled with reporters and lawmakers. "And we now have the emails to prove it." He tapped a button. The room's large screen lit up again, this time displaying an internal email chain from 2 years prior. Subject: Rhetoric Monitoring Program Expansion. From Policy Director, Office of Domestic Security. To Jamie Raskin, Legislative Liaison. Per your suggestion, we've included language identifying anti-government sentiment, anti-lockdown protests, and election skepticism as markers. We've also expanded the list to include religious institutions showing resistance to federal guidelines. Jamie Raskin sat silently as the room grew tense. "Mr. Raskin," Johnson said, "do you deny having reviewed this memo and approving its contents?" Raskin looked exhausted. "I don't recall approving that exact language. Policy discussions happen all the time and word choices are often made by staffers." Johnson pressed. "You signed it. Your digital signature is right here." The screen shifted. There it was. An authenticated time-stamped approval. Jamie Raskin's signatory approval, March 11th, 2023. The room went dead silent. Then, from the back of the chamber, a voice rang out. Not from a reporter or lawmaker, but from the crowd. Why were you watching my church? Everyone turned to see a middle-aged woman standing in the audience. She held up her phone, showing a letter from the Department of Justice addressed to her pastor. It had warned of potentially subversive messaging in their sermons. Her eyes welled up. My husband is a Marine. We never protested anything. We just prayed for our country. And you put us on a list. Raskin tried to speak, but his voice cracked. I didn't know it went that far. But the words rang hollow. The truth had already been unleashed, and it was spreading. Backroom conversations in Congress turned grim. Members whispered about potential resolutions to censure or investigate Raskin. Even the White House issued a carefully worded statement saying, "Every American has the right to express themselves without fear of government reprisal." Public trust in Congress plummeted. And Mike Johnson? He was now a symbol not of party, but of principle. Even his critics admitted he had ignited something deeper than politics. Outside Capitol Hill, rallies grew. Not just conservatives, but liberals, libertarians, independents, and apolitical Americans gathered in unity around one message. We will not be watched. We will not be silenced. The battle lines had shifted. This wasn't just a confrontation between Mike Johnson and Jamie Raskin anymore. It was the people versus the machine. The Capitol had seen its share of scandals, but nothing quite like this. What started as a heated exchange between two congressmen had erupted into a national awakening. Washington was no longer insulated, it was under a microscope. In a special joint session called Under Mounting Public Pressure, Speaker Mike Johnson addressed both chambers of Congress. His voice was calm but resolute. We are standing at a crossroads in American history, not between Democrats and Republicans, but between liberty and tyranny, between truth and deception. For years, we were told certain things were conspiracy theories. We now know many of them were fact. Behind him were two screens, one displaying redacted documents unsealed under subpoena, the other a loop of whistleblower testimonies. Church groups monitored. Parents labeled extremists. Peaceful protesters tracked and profiled. If you spoke too loudly, they listened. If you prayed too publicly, they recorded. If you questioned too boldly, they targeted. Gasps and murmurs rippled across the room. Some members looked down at their desks, ashamed. Others scribbled furiously in notepads. But most just sat in stunned silence. Mike Johnson paused, scanning the chamber. This isn't about Jamie Raskin. This is about a system that grew too arrogant, too unaccountable. Mr. Raskin may have signed the memo, but he didn't build the machinery. We all let this happen. Every single one of us. The gallery erupted into applause, not from party loyalists, but from ordinary citizens invited to witness the session. There were veterans, teachers, business owners, and pastors. And their presence made the moment real. Then came the real kicker. Johnson reached into his folder again, that same brown folder that had become a symbol in itself, and pulled out a new document. This, he said, is the Restoration of Civil Liberties Act. Effective immediately, it demands the dismantling of all unauthorized domestic monitoring programs, provides retroactive protections for wrongly flagged citizens, and installs independent oversight over federal surveillance authorities. As he read the bill's opening line, "We, the people of the United States, reclaim our right to speak, worship, and dissent without fear," the room stood in unison. Even some Democrats, the bold ones, clapped. Jamie Raskin, now seated in the third row, didn't move. His career was in tatters. But even he seemed to acknowledge the gravity of what had transpired. The aftermath wasn't just political, it was cultural. Across the country, schools began holding civics town halls. Churches that had felt the pressure reopened their community forums. Podcasts, radio shows, and even major television networks dedicated programming to civil liberties awareness. Students researched the Constitution not for grades, but out of genuine curiosity. And Americans, tired, cynical Americans, began believing again that their voices mattered. Mike Johnson, once seen as just another speaker, was now being discussed as a symbol of constitutional revival. Murals of him holding the folder popped up in cities. One billboard in Texas read, "He didn't yell. He didn't mock. He just exposed the truth." Jamie Raskin, meanwhile, issued a second, more direct statement weeks later. In hindsight, I failed to scrutinize certain policy suggestions that compromised basic freedoms. I let ideology blind me. For that, I am sorry. But by then, the country had moved on. Not out of spite, but because it was finally looking forward again. In the final days of the congressional session, Johnson addressed the nation from the Capitol steps. The founders didn't write the Constitution for safe times. They wrote it for moments like this, when truth is unpopular, when power is tempting, and when liberty needs defenders. We must never forget. The government works for the people, not the other way around. The crowd below him, diverse and united, stood silently. No chants, no slogans, just silence and a deep respect. For in that moment, under the American flag, lit by the golden dusk, a nation rediscovered its spine, and the man who helped spark it simply nodded and walked off stage. The truth had been unleashed, and America had answered.